here, well, of making a knife from recycled metal. This is something that I do a lot. A lot of knife makers and uh, knife smiths and people that do a lot of uh, blacksmithing. They often look down on the concept of using recycled metal, mystery metal, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's there's some opportunities there to make some really cool and interesting knives, and I'm gonna walk you through the process here about what I'm planning to do, and then I'm gonna shoot some video of me executing that plan, and ultimately leading to some knife. Not like this one. This was one of the first semi-successful pieces of Damascus that I made myself with my own little power hammer. Um, it's got a pretty nasty inclusion there that after I etched it in ferric chloride showed up as a rusty crack, and so I gave this away as a gift to someone to use as a sort of a memento, not as a a knife that you'd be using on any kind of regular basis. That significant fracture, it's just not going to hold up. So not everything turns out perfectly. Not everything turns out as we plan, but doesn't mean it's not important to plan. So what is the plan? Well, generally it works kind of like this. I come up with an idea for a knife that we want to make. We select a piece of donated metal that usually comes from the bin of old lawnmower blades and associated other pieces of scrap metal that friends, neighbors, and acquaintances have dropped off and said, "Here, could you make something out of this?" And I say, "Do you want something?" They're like, "No, but you can have it if you want to use it." And I'm like, "Sure." And so I've got a big stack and pile of it, and I'll just pull something out that's sized up where I can work with and go from there. Generally, after that, I sort of sketch out the possible shapes based on the metal I've got. Lawnmower blades are quite irritating to work with. They've got a lot of compound angles already bent into the metal, so the first thing you got to do is heat it up and flatten it out so you have some idea what you're working with. They've already got some bevels cut onto the cutting edges, so you've got to look at removing some of that stuff as well. And so you don't have a perfect shape, and then you got those pesky holes where it attaches to the lawnmower that really screws everything up. So, um, you got to figure out what you can do along with what you want to do before you try to use uh, salvaged or scrap metal. I'm also going to scavenge around the shop and see what I can find for some handle materials. I've got a lot of options there, some things I've made, some things people have given me, and I'll see what I can do. And then at some point in time, you just got to stop thinking about it and got to start making something, even if the only thing you make is mistakes. You learn from every one. I've got a box full of knives that didn't quite turn out the way I planned, and I like to give those away when people buy the ones that did turn out nice. See about making sort of a mid-sized skinning hunting kind of knife. My material is going to be a lawnmower blade. I know I've got several in the shop. I can find one that should allow me to make the size knife that I want to make. Now, here's some things about lawnmower blades. Um, right off the bat, this material is pretty tough. You're constantly hitting rocks and well, maybe not everyone. Around my house, um, my dad has always been one of those guys that if there was something that you could run over with a lawnmower, he's already ran over it twice. And so lawnmower blades, I know firsthand, can take a hell of a beating. And they're tough. They're resistant to a lot of this kind of stuff. But it's also important to know that they don't rust up and they don't wear out really so much. And people think, well, the grass is not really all that tough. Yeah, that's true, but think of how many pieces of grass you're hitting with that blade over and over and over again. Sure, that fine cutting edge that's on that blade when it's new doesn't last, but overall, those blades are pretty tough. They don't erode away. They don't rust up to nothing. They're pretty corrosion resistant. That's pretty good. And believe it or not, you can actually make them fairly hard. If you think about it, a lot of times the way that the blades mount onto the mowers, they have some, unique shapes stamped through the blade that bolts around a shaft, and just given the centrifugal force and the constant stress and pressure, if that steel wasn't hardenable, those pieces would wear out over time, And generally speaking, you can wear the ends of a lawnmower blade down to a nub, and the spots where it attaches and hooks on are still going to look like they're straight from the factory. So that's good. So some of these blades are actually pretty good for making knives, I think, but some are literally crap. What you want to do is do a bit of a spark test, and basically you're going to hit it with your angle grinder. You're going to watch the types of sparks that come off, and you're looking for branching sparks. If you don't see a lot of branching sparks, it's probably not a real high carbon steel. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be a super good blade, but it means it's not going to be a super normal, regular, high carbon kind of blade. Sometimes you'll have some really unusual alloys that's used in lawnmower blades, and you'll get some things that don't quite look like they're very high carbon as far as the sparking, but if you heat it up, quench it, check it, they're harder than woodpecker lips, and you can do pretty much anything you want with them. Um, Lawnmower blades are not always easy to sharpen, and sometimes they don't hold the best edge. But if you're making knives that are more collectors than everyday using things, something that you're going to use every day, that's less of an issue. But most of my knives are utilitarian. They're built for people that want something cool, unique, and original, but they're also going to use them. And so I like a blade that will hold a decent edge, but that's not so hard that it wears you out trying to sharpen it if you do get it dull. As far as the wood, um, I've got a pretty nice selection of boards. A friend of mine used to have a sawmill, used to make some custom furniture, and so he's got a lot of stuff there, has given me quite a few pieces. Oh, here's a piece of this, here's a piece of that, and a 4 foot long, inch and a half thick, 5-6 inch wide piece of scrap lumber from a woodworking shop will make handles for dozens and dozens of knives. So there's lots of opportunities there to make some really cool stuff. My current selection, I've got some white oak, some poplar, some Osage orange, a little bit of cedar that a friend's got in the shop for some stuff that he's doing. I can always steal a piece or two off of that and no one will know. And believe it or not, I've got some really weird stuff, like I've got some hackberry. There might even be a snag of dogwood lying around. Dogwood's really pretty, and you can make some beautiful stuff with it, but it has a really bad problem in that it shrinks and swells both lengthwise and widthwise, so with and against the grain, and it shrinks and swells with and against the grain at different rates, and so it's really hard to keep it to where it stays put together and doesn't fly apart, and so epoxying dogwood handles is probably not a good idea. You probably want to put some pretty serious pins in there, and you really want to hammer those ends out and swell them up so that it can't come off even if it wants to. And then I've got some micarta that I made. Made it out of black and gray felt that I bought at Walmart. Put it together with a little bit of fiberglass Bondo resin, and works pretty good. I figured up that for about $50 worth of material, you can make about $40 worth of micarta and lose most of the hair off of your fingers, knuckles, and parts of your forearms trying to get the glue off of you when you're done. Having said that, I've also done some really interesting stuff using different colored burlaps. I made a really wicked one out of green burlap, and I made a WVU Mountaineer themed blue and gold handle out of blue and gold burlap micarta. So you can do some cool stuff with it. I'm not sure what I'm going to use on this, but it's probably going to be a piece of white oak. If my mower blade works out to where I can get a thick enough handle that I want with some of the poplar I've got, because my poplar's not quite as thick, I might do that. If I get a really awesome looking blade, I may use some of the dwindling supply of Osage orange, because it has a really pretty orange looking color, and I've recently purchased some semi-precious gemstones, and I'm thinking about laying some blue semi-precious gemstones into that orange handle. It'll have sort of that blue and gold look. It'd be very popular here in West Virginia in amongst the Mountaineers. Marshall fans not so much, but who really cares about them anyway? Construction. How am I going to put it together? Lots of techniques I could try. Basically, the big questions are always, is it going to be a full tang or a hidden tang construction? Am I going to put pins, lanyards, um, gaping copious amounts of epoxy? Am I going to allow the geometry of my construction to hold it together? Am I going to pour lead in and around and make a bit of a bolster around the front? I've done all these in times. The geometry thing was actually pretty cool one. I cut a triangular shaped tang, one that got bigger as it went back, and then took a piece of micarta and cut it in half, marked out where the tang would set inside, um, and then ground out a very small recess on both sides so that once I put the tang in, if you try to pull forward on it, the bigger part of the tang is back further in the knife so it can't come out. And then simply epoxied the two parts of the micarta handle back together. And when I sanded it down, you couldn't tell that it was anything but a single piece. It was a cool sort of construction technique, but it was time consuming and annoying as hell to put together that way. So frankly, I've not made any more like that, but that doesn't mean I won't. Really like using the lead if I'm using something like antlers. My antler selection is getting kind of slim until um, the deer season rolls around again next year. My selection of really nice size antlers is pretty much squat. I've got a couple racks that are hanging on the wall in the shop that I use to hang stuff on, and I hate to take them down just to make a handle for a knife that I may or may not sell. So, having said all that, I need to talk just a little bit about the basic blade design. For me, there's 7 points of a good blade design as far as a hunting knife goes, things that I look for when I'm trying to make something like that. I like a pretty steep upswept end on my blade, and that I find personally is really good for skinning. I want a somewhat flat to a drop point kind of a spine on top of the blade. I don't want I don't want too much of a drop, but I don't want it perfectly flat either, but I don't want any of those other crazy things. When you look at some of those clip points and things like that, I've made some of them, but the only thing I ever really get is tiny welts on my arm because my little grinder tends to throw sparks to hell and back whenever I try to grind that way, so not a big fan of that. Um, I'm looking for something in that 3 to 4 inch cutting edge on my blade. That's a pretty good size for most stuff you're going to hunt here in the east anyway. Um, and I want a steep hollow ground edge. I want to put a bevel on there that's going to go up the blade a fair way. I'm not going to put any kind of special kind of grind on that. Just nice and hollow so that I can lay that beveled cut down on my whetstone when I'm done and just slide it across and bring it down to a super fine cutting edge. I really like to sharpen knives like that. That's the knife that I like, I think, to keep a pretty good cutting edge. You might like something else. You buy one of the knives, feel free to sharpen it however you like. Another big thing is I think it's important that a knife just feels good in your hand. It's got to, the grip's got to be big but not too big. It needs to have some size to it so it doesn't slip around. You don't want to lose it or nothing like that when you're, playing around. I like my blades to be weighted a little bit more towards the front, and I want everything, the construction, the thickness of the blade, the material, I want it to be strong enough to behead small critters. When you're chopping the feet off of a squirrel, or chopping the head off of a trout, or you're trying to break open and cut out a deep, pop the hip socket on a white-tailed deer, or what have you, it's important that a knife not just be flimsy little fillet kind of blade. It's got to have some strength to it. And so if I can make a knife that does all 7 of those things, I think it's a pretty good all-around hunting knife. So before I head to the shop, I like to sort of sketch up what I'm going to try to do. And I don't use any fancy software, even though I am a college professor and I teach geographic information systems. I'm well versed in a lot of computer stuff. I use hundreds of programs over the years, everything from AutoCAD to Socket GXP. I can make and draw and machine and design things in 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional shapes. I've frankly done it all, as well as complicated analytical laboratory work. But when it comes to doing things like this is where the other side of my brain takes over, and it's no longer about the science, it's all about the art. And the art doesn't need all that. I just need a piece of paper and a pen to get started. And this was a brown paper bag, and I started sketching out some ideas for a handle. It started looking an awful lot like the last knife I made, which is a perfectly good knife, but I wanted to make something a little bit different. So I decided to make the handle a little bit smaller. A similar kind of blade because I like that kind of blade. And you can see the basic design. I like to have that transition from handle to blade to be at an angle. I think it's prettier that way. That's the only reason it's there. I'm going to put one pin in the front, going to put a big old lanyard. I've got a 1/2 inch aluminum tube in the back. I like to cut in sections. It makes a pretty respectable lanyard hole. You can't maybe make it out here on this, but my intent is to have a slight sort of a depression on that top line of the handle. I want it to come in ever so slightly. I'll simply grind that out. The bottom, I want it to be pretty much the same as like the top, with just a subtle pickup, so that the back and the front are both bigger than the middle, so that you know where it's at. You can index it in your hand. If it starts to slide forward, the handle gets bigger. If it starts to slide back, the handle gets bigger, but not so much that it's obvious and looks like a dog bone or nothing. I want it to be a subtle sort of feel. And as far as the rest of it, I want the blade to be a little bit smaller than the handle. I want the handle to be a little bit longer. I want that sort of beveled cutting edge to be sort of the part of the blade that's bigger than the handle. So if you kind of see that line across that bottom of that handle, where I'm anticipating that bevel is going to go based on the thickness of the lawnmower blades, it should be in that neighborhood. Maybe not quite. Bevel might rise a little higher. I'll have to wait and see. I'll cut me a little mark in there behind it. I don't know what the heck those things are called. We call them Easies because that's the nickname of one of my friend's son. Comes to the shop sometimes and makes knife. We call him Easy. He's seen this in a picture on the internet, cut it in. I said, dang, that's actually kind of pretty. And so I started putting him in mind sometimes. The key with those is to remember to do that before you harden the blade. Otherwise, instead of an easy, they ought to be called a hard as hell, because it's just not fun to do. I'm going to grind that bevel on the bottom, and then I'm going to grind a partial bevel on that upslope part of the blade on the front. I'm not going to bring it to a true point, but I'm going to slim it down so that by the time that bevel's ground in, that tip is going to be pretty small and pretty sharp, and it's going to be good for penetrating through hides, to gut animals, to defend yourself, to stick in a picnic table when you're sitting there eating a steak, to make it look all rough and tough and manly. Whatever. Maybe it's just there because I think it's cute. So, all the best ideas, they start off small just like people, and they grow over time into uh, quite the undertaking. So I'm going to set out with my plans in tow, go to my shop, start digging through the rummage barrel, and begin to make a knife. I'll take some pictures, I'll shoot some video, and you can follow me on YouTube and see the next videos in the segment about this making of this hunting knife. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, if you like what I'm doing, if you find what I'm doing interesting, click the logo up there to subscribe. If you want to watch more videos from my library, check out some of the stuff here. YouTube has been so kind to make suggestions based on your search preferences. Have a nice day.